Welcome to the Blue White Illustrated Penn State Wrestling Show. I'm Thomas Frankar, Greg Pickle, our wrestling expert and reporter, here to give you the latest on what's going on with the Nittany Lions on and off the mat. And it's the off season, although there's not an off season in wrestling this year, Greg. It seems like everything is going full steam ahead, including a lot of movement in the coaching ranks, which is what we're going to be focusing on in today's show. So how you doing, and what's going on with the Nittany Lions that you want to talk about today?
Yeah, so obviously Penn State Wrestling had some staff changes, or a staff change, I should say, with Jimmy Kennedy following David Taylor, his brother-in-law, to Oklahoma State. We talked about that on last week's show. And, we put together a hot board, some names to know and some people to watch. And one of them was Nick Lee, the obviously multi-time NCAA champ from Penn State, who just recently lost the 65-kilogram U.S. senior national team spot to Zane Rutherford, went to Turkey with Zane to be his training partner, which is obviously a tremendous thing to do after you just lost to the guy for a shot at going to the Olympics. So he went over there and did that, and then he comes back. Penn State has this coaching staff opening, and Cale Sanderson, in a way only Cale Sanderson can, gets Jeff Byers, the program play-by-play announcer and voice of the NLWC Wrestling Podcast, ask what he says. I have one more last question. I'm really sorry, but I got one last question, for the fifth time. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but not much. And he asked him about the staff opening, and Cale Sanderson says, well, yeah, I know what we're going to do. We got to get the paperwork and stuff done. And, basically saying you got to get you got to jump through the hoops of the hiring process, but they were going to go with Nick Lee. And so, boom, there it was last Friday. And that news became official back on Monday. So Penn State goes with a familiar face, a guy who moves into the coaching ranks for the first time. But look, we talked about it before. I think that just means a lot less in wrestling than it does in other sports. And with the NLWC participation, we talked about this with Thomas Gilman going to Oklahoma State with David Taylor. These guys, I don't want to say they're coaching wrestlers per se, but they kind of are, because they're wrestling with guys on the current team every day, giving each other pointers, tips, training sessions, etc. So I think Nick Lee will slot into this well. He will obviously have name recognition on the recruiting trail, and he's a guy who can work with your 125 through 157 pound wrestlers who that was Thomas Gilman's role in a lot of ways. So he'll work with those first 5 weight classes and replace not just Jimmy Kennedy in that regard, but also what Thomas Gilman did, because Penn State did lose 2 guys who could work with those first 5 weight classes. Gilman not on staff, but a key member of that. And of course, Nick Lee not on staff previously, but a key member of that with the NLWC too. So now it's just in a more formalized third assistant coaching role for the Penn State wrestling program. So not a great surprise that this is direction Cale Sanderson decided to go. Clearly this was, we hear James Franklin talk a lot about his short list of candidates and how he keeps a list and blah, 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 should they need to make a hire. Well, obviously, there's no doubt Cale Sanderson does the same thing, and surely he has been thinking for quite some time about Nick Lee possibly joining his staff. He did not previously have an opening. Now he does, and he fills it with a former Nittany Lion.
How do you, and I know you just laid out that this is a little bit harder to rate necessarily when it comes to coaches in wrestling, but how do you rate the hire in terms of really positive, in terms of former Penn State wrestlers, who... Is this the preference? Is this the choice that you think is the best for the opening? And I guess kind of on the give us your opinion on that, so that we kind of have a reference point of how this shakes out, given some of the other stuff with former Penn State wrestlers that we're going to be talking about in just a little bit, with them going into the coaching ranks as well.
Yeah, so no doubt about it. I think that when you listen to Cale Sanderson talk about this hire on the Nittany Lion Wrestling Club podcast, it sounds to me like if they could have made the move officially the same day Jimmy Kennedy left, they would have, which tells me Nick Lee was at the top of the list as soon as they found out Jimmy Kennedy was moving on. And look, we talked about it previously, but, Penn State could have had really whoever it wanted for this job, but Cale Sanderson knows what his staff needs, both from a working with guys in practice in those first 5 weight perspective, but also just the kind of person he wants on the mat and off the mat. And number one, maybe first and foremost, is these guys still compete. Kale, Cody, Casey, they all compete with these guys in practice. They all wrestle with them. So, rule number one, I think, is that you have to fit the culture and the way that these guys go about their business. And then number two, you have to still be ready to get out there on the mat and roll around with these guys. And Nick Lee certainly knows the culture, is familiar with the culture, and fits what these guys do well. And then beyond that, he's still competing. So one note I will make is that I do think he will now continue to compete. I wasn't sure previously, but there's been some reporting in recent days that suggests he will continue to compete at the international freestyle level while being a coach at Penn State, and there's precedent for that. So he will be doing a lot for these guys, again, on and off the mat. So, yeah, it's a very positive thing for Penn State. And if you look at our hot board, we had some names on there that were not a part of the Penn State family, but a majority of them were. Mm-hmm. And so, that it felt like that was likely, maybe not a guarantee, but it felt like it was likely to go that way, and it certainly did.
It seems interesting where we have this conversation, and I love your pinned tweet on X. If you haven't seen Greg Pickles' profile before, it's that, no, he doesn't think LeVar Arrington's going to come back and coach linebackers. But it seems like the opposite when it comes to wrestling, where, yes, the top former wrestlers are definitely candidates to come back and be coaches if they so choose. So just interesting little changes in dynamics and wrinkles between different sports. But let's move on. Let's talk about some of those other Penn State Nittany Lions who are in the coaching ranks, who have gone from their wrestling careers to now their coaching careers. So what's the movement there, and what do Penn State fans need to know about some of their favorite names from the past and where they are across the nation?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we talk in other sports. It's a good segue, T. Frank. We talk in other sports, specifically football, all the time about coaching trees and guys who were on your staff as an X and maybe an assistant coach, and now they're on another staff as a Y or a coordinator, or maybe they went on to be a head coach. We talk about that in football all the time. In wrestling, we don't as much, but there are a lot of former Penn State wrestlers in the coaching ranks right now. Some of them are moving around. So obviously, the biggest one of late, the headline was David Taylor entering the coaching ranks for the first time at Oklahoma State. Jimmy Kennedy, part of that's Cale Sanderson's staff going with him. I'm going to go in reverse order of the rundown here just because that's where I started. But Bryan Pearsall, the former Nittany Lion, he finished 5th one year at Big Tens. He is going to be David Taylor's recruiting coordinator at Oklahoma State. So another former Nittany Lion heading to Stillwater. And, Pearsall was at a couple different places. He was at Army. He was at Rutgers. I can't recall off the top of my head where he was most recently, but been in the wrestling game for a little bit now from a coaching and staff perspective. So he joins David Taylor at Oklahoma State. Vincenzo Joseph was a guy we had on our hot board for the Penn State opening. Maybe not, it didn't feel necessarily like it was a super likely hire or possible hire. That was a gut feeling at the time, but we now know that it was a good gut feeling because he is taking the NLWC equivalent head coaching job at North Carolina. So Jake Varner is the NLWC head coach here at Penn State, freestyle coach of the year from USA Wrestling. So Vincenzo Joseph is taking a job similar to his at North Carolina, leaving the Stanford staff where he was an assistant coach. And then Mark Hall just left an assistant coach job at UPenn for a off-the-mat job, director of ops role at Oklahoma. So a lot of interesting stuff going on here. In case somebody asks in the comments, people are wondering if, like football, people in a role like Mark Hall's at Oklahoma, which is not an analyst role, but an off-field role, if they are allowed to participate with the guys, if any rules pass similar to football is trying to pass a rule where analysts and other off-field staffers can participate in practice and in game day instruction. I'm not sure. I will have to look into that. The wrestling committee, the D1 wrestling committee, I don't think is meeting anytime soon, so we'll have to see. But he could also join the RTC if Oklahoma has one, which I don't know off the top of my head. But anyway, there's ways around that in wrestling. So ultimately, the point of this is that Cale Sanderson has obviously continue, and there is an RTC at Oklahoma, so that could be a possibility. But we'll see what he decides to do on that front. But I think the takeaway here is that a lot of Penn State wrestlers from the past, you may not realize they're coaching, and they're assistant coaches here, or ops guys there, or recruiting coordinators here, or what have you. But there's a lot more out there than you'd think. And it just goes to show that, guys don't always have to stay at Penn State in the NLWC or in the Penn State wrestling staff. They can take those things they learned and put them to use elsewhere. And certainly there's a lot more guys doing that than just David Taylor. He's the headliner, but it's a good reminder of how many guys from the past at Penn State in the Cale Sanderson era are out coaching in the college wrestling world as well.
So last 5 minutes of the show here, we're going to talk about the future of Penn State wrestling. What I think Penn State fans are really excited about is the class of 2024. The final rankings by MatScout are out. So how do the Nittany Lions do in this next class, and what are the implications of some of these guys coming in to the program?
Yeah, so we'll lead off with Luke Lilledahl. Where else would we start? Wyoming Seminary stud. Lightweight guy who, as we talked about on last week's show, if you missed it, you can find it here, either on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcast. But a candidate to take over the 125-pound job for Penn State in 2024-2025 if Braden Davis would either redshirt to move up to 133 or just take the 133 job outright. So I think that from Aaron Nagao, which there's still a lot to figure out there, but just goes to show you that there's a reason why people think Luke Lilledahl could start for Penn State as a true freshman. So MatScouts ranked him as the number one prospect in the country, a 5-star, and he is one of a number of Penn State guys who made the top 10. Penn State, this goes back to the conversation, T. Frank, we had last week where people, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, about the, utter concern that Penn State, or some in the Penn State community had about David Taylor leaving the Nittany Lions and taking a bunch of guys with him. This is one of the things that, again, it could happen in the future. Penn State, down the road, may not end up being the only team with multiple wrestlers in a recruiting class's top 10, but they are this year because once you move on from Luke Lilledahl, you have Wisconsin upperweight Connor Mirasola, who is number 5 on the MatScouts 2024 big board. New York Zack Ryder, he's an upperweight, maybe 74, maybe 84, is at number 6. Wyoming Seminary, Luke Lilledahl's teammate, Joe Sealey, who projects at 165, is at number 8. And then Connor Mirasola's brother, Cole, is at number 14. So you have those multiple guys in the top 10. You have Cole Mirasola at 14, and then PA middleweight Brock Weiss, he checks in at number 91. But, again, the key takeaway here to me is just that, again, you have another indication of how Penn State just continues to reload. I mean, I look at this list, and I don't have the full top 50. I'm not going to sit here and scroll it and bore everyone. But, I think the point is that you'd be very hard-pressed to find another school checking in on these rankings with, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, guys in the top.
Half the top 10, yeah.
Right. So it just goes to show that, when Penn State goes out and recruits, they can do it anywhere. Doesn't have to be from this area, even though there's obviously so much talent in this area. They can go east, west, north, and south to get the best wrestlers in the country. I think it's interesting sometimes, and this is going a little bit off on a tangent, but I would just recommend, if you're not, some of you just know the roster. You could probably name guys that, have been in the room a few years but haven't been on the mat. Some are maybe a little bit more casual, if you will. But, if you're fall into more of that bucket, just scroll the roster sometime and see where the makeup is. Because sometimes when I talk to people about Penn State wrestling, there's this perception that everyone was a PA star or from the Mid-Atlantic, New Jersey, whatever. And there's a lot of different parts of the country represented on that roster. So another example here with these class of 2024 rankings. And again, I think when you look at this group that we just talked about, Lilledahl probably the one that if any of these guys are going to see the mat, barring injury or any kind of other unexpected changes, he's the one that probably makes the most sense. Could Connor Mirasola win the job at 197 or somewhere in that, 184 perhaps? We'll see where Carter Starachi decides to go, and then we can figure that out from there. He's probably the second closest, Connor Mirasola. Zack Ryder is in that same conversation too, as a guy that Depending on where Starocci goes, if 74 or 84 is open, he could have a say there. So I would be really surprised if there's 3 or more Penn State freshman wrestlers starting for the Nittany Lions this upcoming season. But 1 and possibly 2, I wouldn't rule that out. So we'll have to wait and see. And again, it's important to remember that even if we think we have that answer in October or November, we're almost certainly not going to have it until a little bit later in the year. That's just the way these things tend to go. So
yeah, I noticed
time will tell.
Yeah, what's the lineup going to be like this week? Well, we'll find out when they go out there. That's been what it's been like the last couple of years. Talking to Cale Sanderson at the wrestling press conferences, which you can check out those here in the fall on the Blue Weight Illustrated YouTube channel. I always forget to do this here on the show because I'm so excited to get into the information. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel because we're doing this once a week now. Your response to the show has been amazing. We love giving this to you, but we want to make sure we keep growing the channel. So like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you get your up-to-date Penn State wrestling information from Greg. And of course, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com is where you go and you get that big board, all the information he talked about. You get it on the regular. So check it out, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. If you want to subscribe, 2 months for $1, go all in on Penn State football, Penn State wrestling, Penn State recruiting, all of that, plus basketball. If you're a Penn State fanatic, join us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, 2 months for $1. But at the very least, it's free to like the channel. It's free to subscribe to the channel, and we appreciate all of your support. That'll do it for this week's Penn State Wrestling Show on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel.